Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. Today is a very special day for the Gaggle. We have Peter Ford, the former British ambassador to Syria from 2003 to 2006, and who is currently now the co-chair of the British Syrian Society. I'm also joined by co-founder George Szamuely. Peter, it's wonderful to have you on, such a knowledgeable person. And unfortunately, my friend, I believe that Syria is going to be back in the news in a very big way, starting after January 20th. Let's see where we stand right now. What are the fronts right now? First of all, we have basically a cessation of major military activity in Syria as part of this almost 10-year-long international proxy war against Damascus. What we have right now is we have sanctions that are being imposed by the United States and pushed upon its allies, making sure, absolutely sure, that Syria cannot recover from this proxy war. We also have the terrorist region called Idlib, which there are those that are talking about a no-fly zone. And as you rightfully pointed out in a previous interview, that if that were to happen, then the United States Air Force would be the cover an Air Force for a terrorist group. This is how bizarre and screwed up all of this is. And also we have in the northeast corner of Syria, the illegal occupation, military occupation by the United States, which is just essentially to deny, again, reconstruction and not allow any kind of conclusion to this conflict that should have never happened in the first place. Where do we go from here? I mean, you want to pick on any one of those three things that I just mentioned?
You've described the situation very well. There's basically a military stalemate in the north after the advances that were made by the Syrian government forces back in the early part of the year. They recovered quite a big slice of Idlib, the southern area. But then they were halted effectively by heavy Turkish military intervention. And that's where the situation has remained, just with some skirmishing ever since. Of course, the Corona situation also militated against any significant military moves. In the meanwhile, Russia has tried by sustained diplomatic effort with Turkey to secure some form of resolution, but hasn't got very far at all. In the meanwhile, the US has consolidated with its own occupation forces. We don't know quite how many, and quite amusingly, Ambassador Jeffrey revealed the point man, Trump's point man for Syria, revealed that they had deliberately avoided telling the president quite how many thousands of US forces were in northeast Syria. Ignorance is bliss, as they say. So withholding information from the commander-in-chief is now standard operating procedure for the political military establishment in Washington. So as a result, Trump did not withdraw those forces, despite efforts to do so. And they are now an important arm of the war, which is actually white hot. That is the economic war on Syria. And this is where nearly all the action is taking place now. And it's a very serious war. As again, Ambassador Jeffrey candidly described it, the US is putting all its focus on causing economic mayhem and destruction in Syria, regardless of humanitarian consequences, is putting all its efforts into blocking the Syrian the main part of Syria having access to the oil, which is in the northeast, controlled by the US through and with its mainly Kurdish proxy forces. there's no reconstruction because international reconstruction through the UN or other international bodies is blocked by the US. And so the result is that the pips really are squeaking.
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned James Jeffrey, because he's very open and blunt about U.S. policy there. He's actually quite gleeful about it, is that the humanitarian crisis, that's the point of the policy, and it is has gained enormous traction. I mean, you were a professional diplomat. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about James Jeffrey's background, but I mean, is this where diplomacy has descended? I mean, I thought diplomacy was resolve conflicts, and here's an envoy that lied to his boss, was in cahoots with, and I will use the term deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, and continuing this war. And I want to talk about war aims and goals a little bit later. Go ahead, George, you can jump in.
Well, no, I was going to ask Peter, now yesterday, the Trump administration slapped on additional sanctions on Syria. So that seems to me no particular reason to do so, other than this has now become a regular thing. You know, every few weeks you add more sanctions on Syria. But now, I mean, you talk about this as this economic war on Syria, which is what the Trump administration has been waging. The real question is, will this become a hotter war under a Biden administration? Because the pronouncements from Antony Blinken have suggested that they are prepared to relaunch their regime change war in Syria. Do you expect that to happen?
I foresee two things. One, that the Biden administration will pretend to come up with a new Syria policy, and two, that policy will look very much like the existing policy with new clothes. Not conceivably better, but yes, conceivably worse. We could see a return to the Obama era, direct support for jihadi groups. I wouldn't rule that out. We're very close to that already. And a return to this idea of a no-fly zone, which could possibly apply over Idlib, and that would be very scary. That would be inviting confrontation with not just the Syrian Air Force, but the Russian Air Force, which in one of the few positive developments of the war, at least the US and Russia have not got into air dog fights over Syria, but that is now likely to be called into question. So the outlook, I'm afraid, is not optimistic. And it's not even as though continuation of the present high pressure policy or ramped up pressure policy would be likely to work. The Assad government has been facing pressures, much worse pressures than this, actually, on the military battlefield. Back in 2015, ISIS were at the gates of Damascus. And for several years, the US was pumping billions of dollars into the armed jihadi groups before it began to have second thought. If the Assad government did not crumble under these earlier pressures, it's inconceivable that it would crumble today. Anyone who believes that this policy of economic pressure is going to produce some kind of suicide note out of Assad, some political concessions that would amount to surrender, they must be deranged.
But the United States always pursues this. It's like there never seems to be any rationale for it.
Yeah.
Like the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. I mean, it's like it's not yielding anything, and it's clear Iran isn't going to surrender under maximum pressure. And as you say, I mean, if Assad didn't buckle under much greater pressure, why would he do it? But I think it's the United States just likes to punish people. I mean, if it's like, if you defy us, we'll just punish you. We'll just make life as miserable for you as possible. Not because it's going to lead to anything, but we just want to basically, punish you, make it hard.
Or George, the flip side, I completely agree with you. But the flip side of that is that, in lieu of a policy, let's just immiserate them because they don't have a policy.
Absolutely. That's right. Let's call the policy by its true name, revenge, for the failure of 10 years of the earlier policies. All that's left now is to inflict punishment on the people, and putting it at its most generous, denying a clear victory to the other side, where the casualties are the people of Damascus and Aleppo who are lining up in bread queues and gasoline queues, quite what US security interest is served by the sight of these pathetic queues in Syrian cities escapes me. No, it's vindictiveness. It's vindictiveness dressed up as policy. That's what it is.
Peter, one of the things that's happening in the UK is that there seems to be this attempt by the mainstream media, particularly the BBC, to bolster the reputation and image of the white helmets in light of Le Misere's death, however he came to his end here. I find it really interesting is that this bolstering of this propaganda group, and at the same time, the US and its allies have essentially obliterated the OPCW, which kind of sets up a very interesting scenario in the beginning of next year. You have the OPCW basically sidelined. You have this propaganda outfit called the White Helmets. So you can, you said dress it up in a different way, but they like this chemical attack thing because you get the pictures, and we believe that they were staged, and there's ample evidence of people that will make that claim. So you have the attack itself, the alleged attack that will be, and then you have the pictures and the babies and the blown up buildings and all this. It seems to me that they're not walking away from that strategy, okay? Because they got burned with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They need the pictures. They need the human story to make this work here, and they're not abandoning that strategy. I would say that this is a key strategy to keeping this conflict going because, Ivanka, all she had to do was show her father pictures of dead babies and let the missiles fire, okay?
That's exactly right. I think the US and its allies drew the conclusion from the Iraq WMD debacle that they were unable, that all they could produce visibly was a dossier. What they needed was a smoking gun, which of course didn't exist. So solution, you invent one, you fake the smoking gun. And that is the job of the White Helmet, to provide the videos and the fake testimony, the staged incidents, which amount to the smoking gun. And this is essential to sustain public support for these hybrid, covert, proxy, even direct wars. The White Helmets are pivotal to the strategy of maintaining the narrative in order to manipulate our own public opinion. That's the game. It's no accident that the White Helmets bear their insignia in the English language, not in Arabic. Their target audience, their handlers ensure that they're wearing signs in English, and then everything is tailored for that Western audience.
Yeah, well, no wonder they're award-winning, documentaries, because everybody can understand it. It's all in English.
Right, but there's no question that's true, that it's what makes humanitarian intervention much easier to pull off than other kinds of intervention, because you can always interview a random group of refugees who will tell you some terrible horror stories and so on. And by the time serious investigation can start, the media will be saturated by these poor babies and so on. So so that's why it's always easier to pull off than the weapons of mass destruction, which is a little hard. It's a little hard to fake chemical weapons or even nuclear weapons. But the thing though is that what was odd about those things, that Trump launched those missiles, but they were still nonetheless quite limited. I mean, Trump never really followed through on them. I mean, we thought
the Russians were informed in advance.
Exactly. So it seemed like, oh, now it's a major escalation is in the works, but it didn't happen. Trump just launched this. There was one attack, and then that's it. Then he did another attack a year later. So first of all, one wonders why didn't Trump follow through, and then I guess the next question: will Biden, however, follow through? Will the Biden team be interested in seriously playing this little game?
Yeah, I think the main mission for the White Helmets morphed as time went on, and rather than attempting to provoke direct military attacks, the main aim became to justify the economic war, to justify the sanctions, because there is this narrative that Assad is a brutal dictator who gasses his people, This is pivotal to the narrative required to sustain the economic war. The White Helmets and their handlers would prefer to have a hot war, but that, fortunately, we had a president for a few years who wasn't that stupid that he would be drawn into full-scale war. He just loosed off a few cannons and missiles to make a nice video. But who knows with Biden? And I'm not taking bets. I expect the White Helmets to return to the charge. They have not managed, interestingly, in about 3 years now, since 2018, they've not managed to mount another fake attack, although it seems that attempts have been made. But the calling out of these attempts before they have been made has perhaps staved off some. But it's really significant that the UK establishment is putting so much effort into restoring the image of the White Helmets. They're obviously not past their sell-by date, and we can look forward, as it were, to more interventions based on their so-called testimony.
Peter, I mean, let's look at the origins of all this and where we stand right now. I mean, why was this proxy war started in the first place? And unfortunately, sometimes, I go to the default position is that because they can do it, which is awful, but, because they have the resources and the ideological predisposition to do it. But I mean, what was the thinking? I mean, was it to please Israel, to have Syria, a large country on its border, to be in constant chaos? We have heard American officials say this, intentionally make it a quagmire, somehow balkanize the country, break it up into small statelets, which of course the Brookings Institution years ago was proposing that, which I wonder which Middle East embassy wrote the white paper and passed it over to them with the check. And then also there's the Israel factor, and then there's the Russia factor, and always is the Iran factor. And with this new administration coming in, given that Trump did this maximum pressure, as I completely agree with George, I mean, to what end? It didn't change anything here. But if there's a reinterest with people like Tony Blinken coming into Secretary of State and all the other hoodlums around him, they might be able to say, hey, we got the OPCW, that's out of the way. We got our white helmets here. And now we can use this as another proxy platform to show our displeasure with Iran and try to give the Russians a bloody nose in the process. And of course, the Israelis will be cheering on the sidelines.
Yeah, this was not about Syria.
Right.
It was not about Syria. Has been a victim of its geography and history, being historically a partner of Russia, put it on the naughty list from day one. In that respect, the attempt to change the regime in Syria goes back at least 40 years. And then it was thrown into the arms of Iran. I remember when I was ambassador, one Syrian minister pleaded with a group of us European ambassadors, please don't make us draw closer to Iran. We really don't want to. We're Arabs, they're Persians, they're Islamists, for God's sake. We're secular. Don't push us into the arms of Iran. That's what you're doing. And that's what we continued to do. So I think for the US, just getting at Iran and Russia was more important than securing democracy in Syria. After all, who cares about democracy in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf kingdoms and principalities? That's just an obvious cover.
Right. It's kind of interesting, though, that we had the global war on terror that was launched almost 20 years ago. Yet, who has been attacked in the name of this global war? Syria, Libya, Iraq. All three states were anti-Islamist. All three were secular. So it's kind of interesting that the United States has made no attempt to go after the source of Islamism, which is Saudi Arabia. So it's kind of interesting that this hostility, this regime change operation has been directed at the essentially secular states. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary feature of this.
I think the US never saw a secular state in the Middle East that it didn't want to take down.
Yeah.
I can't think of an exception. Yeah, of course, a lot of it does go back to Israel. That's a long story, but you always have to come back to that. Syria would never bend the knee. It was the last Arab holdout. Otherwise, Syria, Israel had the keys to the shop in the Middle East, but Syria would never bend the knee, and this could not be tolerated. It had to be brought to heel. It never, well, not since at least 1973, has never represented any kind of serious military or strategic threat to Israel. I used to, when I was the ambassador, and we'd have the 6 monthly rollover for the authorizing UN troops on the Golan. And mischievously, I used to tease the Syrian foreign minister, why don't you at least withhold approval once? Get them a little bit worried. And he replied, you must be crazy. You know what the Israelis would do. So, the balance of power is just so unequal that Syria never represented a serious threat to Israel. You can argue about Iran's presence in Syria. Yes, Iran's missile capacity does balance the scales a little bit, but only in a deterrent sense. I mean, the reason for the Israeli attacks, the 200 or maybe it's now 300 bombing raids that have been launched on Syrian territory from Israel, and not a single one in the other direction. But the rationale for that is that Israel cannot tolerate the establishment of any kind of deterrent missile presence on Syrian soil. They want the skies of Syria to be totally open to them and for them to be able to bomb Syria with impunity at any time of their choosing.
Well, the interesting thing is that this is where well, it's always complicated, but this is an extra complication here because the Russian side is basically told the Iranians and the Israelis that we're not really going to get involved in your affairs in the third country, Syria here. And that's a very prickly position to be put in. But for me, the interesting thing is that the survival of the Damascus government all through this shows the resilience of the opposition to Washington and its allies here. I mean, it's incredible that the kind of survival strategies and tactics that Syria has been able to procure. And then at the same time, after all this maximum pressure on Iran, well, the region is quaking in its boots. We have to go back and remember the attack on the Aramco one. Yes, you have overwhelming military capacity, but we have very significant defensive capacity as well. So, I mean, it seems to me that the more it's so counterintuitive, it's so opposite of what the more they push for these maximum pressures on these governments, actually, the more resilient they actually become. And when they become more resilient, then they're deemed more of a threat. You know, this is kind of a vicious circle here.
Exactly. In 2006, when I left Syria, there was still a chance that Syria could be brought within the sphere of influence of the Western powers. We've been through a period of kind of honeymoon with Bashar. He was having tea in Buckingham Palace with the Queen just before I arrived in Damascus. That soured somewhat because of tensions over the Iraq war and Syria's justified belief that they would be next on the chopping block unless they helped the Iraqi resistance to slow the US progress. But in 2006, the situation could have been recovered. It wasn't inevitable that Syria would drift further and further into the camp of adversaries, as the US chooses to call anybody who doesn't kowtow, and specifically Iran and Russia. Syria was eminently recoverable, and they just ended up making the situation worse for the West, and God knows how much worse for the Syrian people.
Right,
in the
Syria is actually
process, encouraging the emergence of Islamist radical groups like ISIS. ISIS was spawned essentially in eastern Syria. They quickly expanded across the border into Iraq, and that's where they had their strongest presence for a long time. But they were spawned out of Al-Qaeda on Syrian territory as a result of all these pressures and the Iraq war. And by making it harder for the Assad government to quell ISIS by these diversions, support for other jihadi groups, it merely prolonged the fight against ISIS, which was never, I would argue, never even close to being an existential threat to any country in the West. The claim was made ad nauseum that they're threatening our civilization. How ludicrous can you get? What kind of civilization is it that could be toppled by a bunch of towel-headed armed gangsters? It was
driving Toyota trucks.
Yeah. We lent them. We were rented an air wing for Al-Qaeda.
George, you wanted to?
Yeah, what is the truth of that? I mean,
Well, go ahead, George.
Yeah, about the origins of ISIS. I mean, there's been all the stories about how pressure was exerted on Bashar al-Assad to release people from prison, and he kind of released a lot of jihadis from prison, and that and then this became the core of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And then subsequently the claim was made that he did this deliberately because he wanted to discredit the opposition. What's the actual story of that? I mean, whom did he release and why did he release them from prison?
Well, you know, here's the thing. Assad is vilified for imprisoning thousands of alleged political prisoners, many of whom are dangerous armed extremists who killed members of the security forces. He gets vilified for that. He gets pressured to release political prisoners. When he releases a bunch of political prisoners, he gets accused of fomenting Islamism. You know, which one is it, guys? You just have to, you know, think back to those days. At the time when a slew of Islamists were released, it appeared that might lead to some relaxation of the situation. There were ongoing talks between the government and some of the more or the less extreme rebel forces. It was thought that this gesture would actually improve the chances of ending the conflict. I don't think you can blame the Syrian government because the opposite turned out to be the case, because the Western powers did not want to see a negotiated end to the conflict in the early days.
Well, Peter, I mean, this is, I guess, for those of us that are watching this is what makes it so perplexing, because, you know, there is a overt, obvious policy of not ending this conflict. And I guess that's what's so frustrating for the three of us and the people watching this video. There are so many ways that this conflict could be wound down very, very quickly, but there is no political will on those on the part of Western governments, because the way I have always looked at this is that they will keep this going until they get the outcome that they want. It's like a roulette wheel. They just keep rolling it until they get, you know, black 13 or something like that. And that is just an insane way to drive a foreign policy, because this is not a board game. This involves a lot of people and suffering here. And again, going back to James Jeffrey, I mean, the audacity and the unconscionable opinion that he expressed in public. I mean, I would have imagined you'd be so ashamed of that being released in the public, but he's actually proud of it, okay? So, I mean, here we go again with this roulette wheel. And, you know, one of these times, this is going to be a tripwire and everyone is going to regret it. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ambassador Jeffrey revealed a cynicism remarkable even by the standards of the US State Department. He boasted about how the American military presence in Syria was the gift that keeps on giving, the gift that keeps on giving, because it's causing problems and hardship for the Syrian people, because it's preventing Russia from having what looks like some sort of victory, prevents Iran from having more satisfaction. So it's the gift that keeps on giving, giving to people like Jeffrey and taking away from the Syrian people who have to suffer without the oil and without the grain. The important, I mean, the northeast is the Kansas of Syria. That's where most of the grain is. And the US forces are effectively preventing trade in those commodities. How this helps the ordinary American feel safer, I really don't know. But
how does it further American national security interests? I'm just always befuddled by that. What do you know, at one point, It has been estimated that the covert CIA operation was like $1 billion a year budget. I mean, spending that kind of money when the country today is desperately in need of infrastructure, the destruction of the middle class. Oh, they need to go 7,000 miles away and control Syria's borders when they won't even control their own back home. See, once you explain these things to people, and people are not explained this story, that's one of the reasons George and I are having you on here, because it is an audacious story if people are just made aware of it.
It's like you said earlier on, Peter, they do it because they can get away with it, because it's cheap, because it's virtually cost-free. There was an article in the New Yorker recently chiding the US for practicing remote controlled wars. It was quite an interesting article and made some good points as far as it went. It was basically saying that we should be uncomfortable about having guys back in Florida or wherever pulling the button and hundreds of people get killed in the Middle East as a result. But this is how modern war is fought at a distance, and the stronger power doesn't expose any flank. It's almost cost-free. But the New Yorker should have extended the argument to the economic war, which is even more important at this stage of the Syrian conflict and is causing more suffering by the imposition of these using sophisticated financial weapons to pulverize the Syrian economy and collaterally to undermine Lebanon as a way of getting at Syria. This is almost cost-free to the US.
One of the things, I'll ask one question and then George will wrap it up for us here. But the moral dimension, that's never part of the calculation, is it? Is this a moral thing to do? And because it's so technological. Go ahead, George.
That's what I was going to elaborate on, because what we really have is a conflict, which isn't really a conflict. It's like there's a conflict between the torturer and his victim. It's like saying, well, it's a fair fight. Here is the torturer who has all these sadistic instruments at his disposal, and then he decides which particular sadistic instrument he's going to apply at any time. Well, shall I pull his fingernails out first, or shall I maybe pull a tooth out, or maybe I should just cut him a little bit? That's the sort of level of the conflict. I mean, that's what I mean. It's like moral. Where is the morality when the conflict is between the torturer and his victim?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. It's not novel. If you just look back to the Vietnam years, bombing of Cambodia, it's not novel. What was novel was a period of about 25 years when nothing terribly evil happened. But you go back as well to the Korean War and carpet bombing and use of nuclear on Japan. There's a long history of the waging of evil.
But Peter, I think that one important difference from those conflicts is that the media played a role in opening the eyes of the American people about the dreadful and senseless conflict in Southeast Asia. They played a positive role. I know because I remember it. I watched it on black and white televisions growing up. But now, when there is a plethora of information, if you're interested, if you make an effort, even with all the censorship going on, you can enlighten yourself here. But I mean, someone told me a couple of years ago, if we look at cable TV and the major broadcasters in the United States, the average American viewer will maybe get 8 to 10 minutes of foreign news a month. Okay. I mean, it's just, Assad is bad, of course. Putin is bad, of course. Iran is bad, of course. There's no explanation. You don't need to explain it because they're bad. Okay. And that's why when you say, oh, there's another a chemical attack. Well, this goes figures. Okay. I mean, the conditioning of the public here. And I think that's what's really dreadful, because in the past, George, just imagine if they'd been RT during the destruction of Yugoslavia. I think that, public opinion might have looked at it very differently. But but there wasn't any outsider looking at it, okay? But we do have it now. And I guess that's, again, the moral pangs I have about this is that you can find out about these atrocious policies, but if you allow the powerful to continue down their path, there's no pushback against them in doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I think this info war is conducted on two levels. One, the general public, which, as you mentioned, is kept in a state of blissful ignorance. But then there's the war for the narrative among the elites. And that's what we're conducting here right now at this minute. And why the BBC felt it had to come out with a program which will only be heard by a few tens of thousands. But,
and they were quite nasty to you.
Yeah. It's not to affect with the masses, but funnily, I just need a deeper analysis. Quite why it's so important to claim the moral high ground among elites. So they have to invent justification.
Yeah.
Quite an interesting subject.
George, you want to wrap it up for us?
No, I think what we're really getting a sense of here is that these wars that the United States launches, they're asymmetric wars because they're against much weaker opponents who have in no means at all in their disposal to fight back. And they are really about American agendas, American politics. They're not in any way anything to do with the interests of the countries involved. And unfortunately, there is never any chance of an improvement. There is never any leadership that emerges in the United States which says, we really have to bring this to an end. I mean, this is ludicrous.
Well, one guy tried it.
But in the end, he didn't really do very much about it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why when something like Trump happens, we're very disappointed in no time at all. And I think so now we're anticipating a new administration, and we all three of us are looking with pessimism. There's very little prospect because there's no upside politically for the incoming administration to bring this war in Syria to an end. Why would they do this? I mean, it doesn't help them with the Israel lobby. It doesn't help them with the Democratic Party. It doesn't help them with the anti-Putin lobby. It doesn't help them with the Saudi Arabia, with the donors, with the military-industrial complex. Why do it? We'll just keep it on. And if the people suffer, let them suffer. We're doing okay.
Okay, I don't know, Peter, are we going to end on a very pessimistic note? We'll give you the last word here. But I thought George gave a good summation there.
Well, I'll end on a topical note and draw attention to the fact that there are now Christmas trees in the squares of Aleppo, something that didn't happen during the years of the US-backed jihadi occupation of Aleppo. Christmas trees in Aleppo. Thank you.
Peter, can you just tell us just a little bit? You're the co-chair of the British Syrian Society. What is that, and how people can find it?
To be quite honest, the British Syrian Society has been effectively paralyzed in its activities for several years because of pressure from the British government. We're unable to convene meetings even before this COVID year. It was virtually impossible to convene large meetings, although we did manage to mount some briefings in in Parliament before last year. We are constantly vilified in the media, particularly on the grounds that my co-chair is an eminent Harley Street cardiologist who just happens to be the father of Asma al-Assad, the wife of the president of Syria. So we get smeared, vilified, and are frankly very limited in what we can do.
Well, we're all used to being treated that way, but that doesn't stop us, okay? So I will revert to your comment before. There are Christmas trees in Aleppo. That warms up my heart here. Peter Ford, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here on the Gaggle. As events move forward, we'll definitely come back and touch bases with you. George, do you want to have a sign off?
No, I mean, it's, thank you very much, Peter. Thank Peter also. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you, guys.
That was really great.